Okay. All right. Yay. Hello, friends. All right. So I think I know almost all of you, but for those that don't, my name is Angelique, and I am the state tournament director here in California. But more pertinent to what we're talking about today, I suppose, is I do a lot of work related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in the world of speech and debate. And today we're going to talk all about judges. Now I'm trying to keep it like cute to like this 1 hour we promised, right? Because I respect your time. So I'm going to ask if you have any particular questions as I'm babbling, if you can jot them down, and toward the end, we'll have like a good question and answer section where we can kind of brainstorm solutions to stuff together. But in the meantime, I've just got a couple quick little points to go over with y'all before we get to that. And I also have your questions you submitted earlier too, which is awesome. So first thing, which I want to kind of talk about, just like different judging standards across California, across the country, right? They're very, very different. What's expected as far as like how you sign up judges. And I think most of you know this, but for those that don't, like I really didn't know this until like 6-7 years ago, how different this is. And so, where I'm from in Bakersfield, California, we have entirely volunteer judges because of like the demographics of our community. It's very hard for, parents to commit and things like that. So the way our tournaments operate is nobody pre-signs up a judge, right? You just show up in the morning with your judges. They sign a little physical card, right? And because of that, we rely a lot on the junior colleges to help us supply judges. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But, the way we do things is no pre-signing up of judges. So it was shocking to me to learn as a little baby coach that is not typical in most places, because that was my full experience, because we don't really travel a lot from this area and stuff. At invitationals and things, right, it's much more common when you register, or for the state championship, when you register, you have to supply your judges at that time. And increasingly, more and more local leagues are adopting this kind of, judging standard where you have to pre-register your judges for one reason or another. You've got to pre-register them. And that can be really hard because sometimes, a lot of these tournaments require these judges to kind of be there the entire day at a minimum, right? Which is it's a long time for anyone to commit to, especially for in-person tournaments when they're, they've got to drive across town or sometimes drive across counties to attend, right? But yeah, they're different. Some tournaments require, just general numbers of judges. Some want very specific pre-registration. And you've got to always kind of be conscious of what system you're using, and maybe if what you're using isn't quite working, adjusting to another. Like I know that we have some leagues that would benefit from maybe a slightly more open-ended judging situation, right? Rather than being like hard, fast pre-registration, they would benefit from it. Another thing that comes up when we talk about pre-registering judges, and I know someone had a question about this, which was background checking judges. Some places require background checks, right? Some school districts or schools require background checks. But there's also some tournaments. I know Glenbrooks is asking you to background check your judges for their tournament next month. What does a background check mean in our context though, right? Because it can mean a lot of different things. I think when most people think of a background check, we all think about what we have to do to get cleared through a school district, right? You get fingerprinted, they run a proper background check on you. Those are great, but you've got to remember those kind of background checks are only going to, weed out people who have been criminally convicted of things, right? And we know that in practice, I don't mean to be grim here, but we know that when it comes to things like sexual assault or things like that, they're underreported, right? Under convicted. And so just because someone passes a background check doesn't necessarily mean that they're totally a safe person to have around. And it becomes a very difficult thing because it would be great if you could just rely on a background check as a clear, concise way to know if a judge is good or not. But it does take a little more legwork. We're going to talk about that again in a minute too. But as far as the background checks, I'll tell you my personal opinion is I think it's important for schools. If schools want a background check their judges and coaches and things like that, I think that's great. I think for a tournament, What's much more useful is having the coaches actually like look into their judges, right? When we say background check, it's in a more colloquial way, right? Like, hey, ask around and make sure this person is safe, because you're going to get a much more honest answer from that, because most people are going to pass a criminal background check, right? Like, including people that we know have done legitimately bad things, right? But they've not done criminally bad things. So background checks are expensive. Criminal background checks can be expensive and they don't necessarily solve. I don't think it's a bad thing, but I don't necessarily think it achieves the goal that like we're trying to achieve to create a safer space for everybody, right? So the next thing with judges is, where do you get judges, right? So obviously I think for this is like the $1 million question for tournaments, for coaches. Even something like the state tournament, where I can mandate a very specific judge quota for every single school, right? We still run really, really tight and thin on our judges. Like, it is so hard to get, like, this year we were very fortunate because with being virtual, I was able to like really bump up the judge requirement, which made judges have a lot better time because they weren't judging back to back. They had lots of breaks and stuff like that. But it is a difficult thing. So first, obvious, I think the most obvious group you can reach to are parents, of course. But you run into some issues, right? On one end, you have some parents who are things like ER doctors, and they're not able to come, especially right now, right? And you've got these like white collar professional parents, of course, who are doing things. And then you also have on the other side of it, where I live, the reason a lot of our parents can't judge is they are, working all day Saturday. And so they just can't come to a debate tournament because they're working in the fields or they're working an office job or something like that. And they physically cannot be there. So parents are great. But one thing I would like you to remember with parents would be that a lot of big corporations, so if those parents work for like a mega corporation, think like a Chevron, a lot of these big corporations actually do kind of like in-kind donations where they will pay their employee their hourly rate to volunteer their time in the community. So Chevron does this, okay, and I know Era Energy does this. These are our kind of local ones, but I think any big, a lot of these big corporations, they want to show that they are, also it's a tax write-off for the corporation, right? So that's why they really want to do it. But that's kind of their community give back thing. And I can tell you places like Chevron, what they also do, if you have a parent who works at Chevron corporate, they will not only pay their employee to come judge your debate tournament, they will also make a $1,000 donation to your debate team. So they will also make, because they also have a volunteer donation thing. So that's one great thing. So definitely talk to your parents on your team about, their relationships where they work. Does your office have an in-kind time donation or something like that? Because if they do, mom or dad might be able to bring several other people with them from their office, which is really cool. Also things like churches, community organizations, right? If grandpa's in the Elks Lodge or something, right? Like they love to come judge debate tournaments. That's another great option. One thing we rely on, like I mentioned very heavily where I live, are community colleges. I made best friends with everybody at the different community colleges, right? The different professors. Your best departments to lean on are going to be things like communications, but also political science, history, philosophy, religious studies, right? Talk to those professors, especially the professors that, teach the, introductory classes and stuff. They are almost always happy to offer extra credit to their students to come out and judge, and they will set whatever parameters you want to set. This is very different because I think in speech and debate, when a lot of coaches think about hiring college kids to come out and judge or asking college kids to come judge, you're thinking about former debaters or you're thinking about college debate teams. And that's not necessarily bad, but those people do come with kind of preconceived notions of what speech and debate can look like or should look like. And that sometimes is in conflict with what we're trying to accomplish at like a high school level, right? And so those things can sometimes be, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But I think college debate kids are awesome. But when we're talking about like really reaching out to these universities, reaching out to the non-debate folks is a great way to get some awesome, panels that are going to better reflect the judge around, the judges at state or nationals, right? You're going to get a more diverse opinion. You're going to get things like that. So that's really awesome too. And kind of the third thing, which is hiring judges, which is something that like until 6 years ago, I did not know people got paid to judge speech and debate. Like I've wasted my life not making money doing this apparently, but there are different ways you can hire judges. So one are alumni, of course, right? And if you're thinking to yourself, I've got a smaller team, how on earth do I get alumni to come judge for me? Go to the really big team in your area and talk to their coach and say, hey, do you have any alum I can hire, right? Like that's one great way to do it, of course. But also just, talking within the community, and that helps. The second thing you can do is there are coach groups on social media. That's probably the most common thing. There's things like high school LD debate, high school policy debate, the National Debate Coach Association, things like that, where people will post like, hey, I'm looking for a judge for X tournament next weekend. Please reach out. Or more often than that, it's usually people posting, hey, I'm free to judge this weekend, especially if it's virtual. Can you hire me? Right? You got to remember that when you're hiring people kind of blindly like that, one, you do have to pay them, of course, right? We want to make sure we're paying them. Fair wage is definitely part of equity in speech and debate as well, and something that I'm pretty passionate about. At a minimum, right, for like a newer judge, somebody that less experience, whatever, I mean, really the minimum somebody should be paid to judge around is $20, right? That's kind of the standard, right? That's kind of the standard minimum. I was like, it's a little loud. There we go. So it's $20 or about $100 a day, give or take, right? So $20 around $100 a day. It varies, of course, there are different factors. Would I be hired as a judge for $20 a day or $20 around? Probably not. Most of you probably would not be either, right? So use your judgment. But the final thing you can do, there are companies that exist that help facilitate judges. One is called Hired Judge. It's out of the Bay Area. And I'm not endorsing or not endorsing that, but just letting you know that that does exist. And I think the way they work is it's like $150 a day or something to hire a judge. So that's an option. And also, of course, when you're going to invitationals, they sometimes will offer hired judge options. But the reality is when you're looking at like most tournaments, when they're offering you a buyout option, right, where you can like buy out your judging, it is almost always double what you would pay somebody to actually come judge for you, right? But you're paying for the convenience of not having to find the judge. But those are all kinds of great, options as far as doing that. And definitely like buddy up with the big teams if they're nice and will talk to you. And sometimes they won't, but if they're nice and they'll talk to you, that's a great option as well. And the other thing to keep in mind when you're searching out your judges is diversity, right? We really want our judge panels to accurately reflect how our students, look and view the world as well, right? And so the beauty is when you're out, if you are in a position to hire judges and actually pay people, you have the opportunity to help find people who are underrepresented in our community and bring their voice to the table. And that's like an awesome, awesome thing. You have the opportunity to give them a paying gig, which is awesome, and experience, which is awesome. And so it's not easy or perfect, but having that kind of in the forefront of your mind as you're hiring these judges is going to make our debate space a better one for everybody. And it's a really, really, great opportunity to do that. Now, the big point that I really want to talk about today, before we get into our awesome questions, is training and accountability, which is they're probably the two things I get the most questions on, which is judge training starting first. How do you train judges? That is like a big philosophical question, and you would get 10 million answers to it depending on who you ask. I come from a much more lay school of speech and debate, so that's a more traditional school of speech and debate. And so I think most people should be able to sit around and understand it. And, that's kind of just my general philosophy, but I understand not all tournaments are that kind of tournament, nor should they be. So for a very basic, like for a league tournament or something like that, I think fantastic judge instructions come from the NFHS and the NSDA. They partnered a couple of years ago and created an online tutorial. It's like a little webinar. It takes about an hour. It's totally free. And we can link you guys to it after this so you have the information if you're not familiar. But it just goes over like the very basics of judging the events. Now, granted, it's from the NSDA. So for California folks, does it cover all of our events? No, right? It doesn't cover Parley. It doesn't cover, OA versus OO, right? It doesn't cover that. But if somebody can judge a public forum round and they understand the basics of that, they can probably judge a parliamentary debate round, right? Like if they can judge an LD round, they can probably judge a Parley round. If you can judge oratory, you can probably judge advocacy. It's really not that substantially different. And what the judge training goes over is just kind of the basics of like how to approach the round, how you rank the kids, how you weigh arguments, how you take notes. It also talks, which I think is really important. Oh yes, thank you. Thank you, Makendra. What it also talks about, which is really important, is how to give proper feedback to the kids. Because I think that is a thing a lot of judges earnestly struggle with, right? Anyone who's spent any time working in a judge house, like I know Carol, you said you work with the judges a lot. Ida, the number one question I would get would always just be like, I don't know what to say, right? they would panic, right? Because they know how hard these kids have worked and they don't want to break their little hearts, right? And so, but we as coaches want constructive feedback, but we also want feedback that's not going to break their spirits, right? And so helping, the judges understand how to give constructive feedback in a productive way, I think that this adjudication training is really fantastic because it does that. And the final thing that I love about it is it has the main training. So the adjudicating speech and debate training has a subsection called cultural competency training. And it's built into the 1 hour training, although you can just do the cultural competency section separately, right? And that's fantastic because it talks about the necessity of being sensitive, right, to different cultures in speech and debate, and also how our comments can display an implicit bias that maybe we don't intend and potentially hurt kids, right? And the beautiful thing about implicit bias, if we're going to find a silver lining to something that's not so positive, right, is that we know studies show, I guess is the way I should say it, studies show that when just mentioning that implicit bias exists usually reduces the negative impacts of it pretty substantially, right? So we've worked that in the world of speech and debate in a couple of different ways. A few years ago at CHASA, I put some language on the top of the ballot, basically just describing what implicit bias is and how it impacts speech and debate, just like a couple sentences, right? Like this impacts our most marginalized kids because it's stereotypes and whatever, right? We saw just that 1 year, which granted 1 year, anecdote, not data. I don't pretend that's not methodologically sound or anything, but we actually saw an increase in, we were studying gender representation specifically. We saw an increase in young women and female presenting students breaking the final rounds that year. Is it, correlation or causation? We can't say because we don't have enough data, but the following year, the NSDA adopted that same ballot language. And now you see it automatically on Tabroom. If you're using Tabroom, it automatically populates on the ballots. And you can take it off if you want, but you shouldn't. You can take it off if you want. So that's a great thing to remind judges of implicit bias. But what we can do as coaches, right, when we are recruiting these judges, is talk to them about implicit bias, right? Like just mention that this comes up, right? Makendra, do you have the implicit bias flyer I made for CHASA? Can you share it on here? Because I don't have okay, perfect. I made this flyer. We give it out at state when state's in person. But also we just shared a lot because it has some basic facts about implicit bias, what it is, and how it manifests in the world of speech and debate, right? Like that a girl is 10 times more likely to be called emotional on a ballot than a boy, right? Like that kind of stuff. And so just kind of bringing that up to folks is a really helpful way to keep our, it's a really great way for us to keep our judges in check and kind of keep them focused on the right sort of thing, the actual arguments being made or the story being told, and not, girls shouldn't stand that way or whatever, right? Like whatever that may be. And so that keeps them really kind of great on track. And so the NFHS training does have that cultural competency section. It's fantastic. I think that NFHS training is perfect beginner judge training. So if you have parents or community members who are, I don't know, what do I do? Give them that. That is a fantastic, it's interactive. It has little Quizlets on it. It's great. For more advanced judge training, that's a little more difficult, right? Because that doesn't really exist in our community. We don't, it's something that's just kind of learned over time, unfortunately. So that it gets a little more difficult, and that's where judges really need to spend some time in the back of the room, right? Actually judging, and that's how they'll get those more experienced things. Yeah, implicit bias training, we just talked about that. The most important thing you can do when you're training your judges, in my opinion, is talk about implicit bias. I know that for state, these last couple of years, we actually haven't given out judge instructions, and that's been a conscious decision. CHSAA had been for about a decade using the same judge instruction packet, and it was like way out of date. It was great, but it was way out of date. And it was like 20 pages long, right? And respectfully, I don't think anyone was actually sitting and reading those 20 pages. I don't think they were. Like, I don't. And the problem with having that kind of judge instruction packet at a tournament is if I give that out as the tournament, then I am saying that this is the proper way to do this kind of debate, right? Like this is how you do policy debate or whatever it might be. And there are a lot of philosophies about the right way to do policy debates. Now I've kind of limited the scope of what our judges are doing, and that's not good. That said, as a team coach, would I give out that kind of judge packet to my coaches or my parents? Yes, because that is a good, as a team coach, that's a great thing to share now. McKendra, I think, don't you have a packet that you give to your parents? Okay, so McKendra can share that with you too. Yes, that's a great, because as a team coach, that's a great thing to hand out. As a tournament director, I don't think it's a great thing for us to hand out because, you know, like I said, I have my own kind of ideas of what speech and debate looks like. You have your own kind of ideas of what speech and debate ought to look like. Neither are right or wrong, right? And I don't necessarily think as a tournament director, it's right for me to dictate that, right? So if we can keep it more broad, that's a good thing. But yeah, the final thing really, really important I want to talk about is accountability, which is the hard part, okay? So as a coach, when you're bringing in these judges, you are responsible, you know, for making sure that they are safe, right? And in the case of, we talked about Glenbrooks at the beginning a little bit, you know, they're requiring that the schools background check their judges. They're not saying what a background check is, right? They're not saying it has to be a biometric whatever. So that means you could just be calling references on your judges that you've hired, for example, right? And I don't think people are going to do this for their parents or whatever, but like if you are hiring someone and you are paying them money, check them out, right? Just take 5 minutes, Google them, look into them, right? Ask around, hey, do you know this kid? Do you know this person? The best thing you can do is look at their paradigm on Tabroom. If they are a judge for hire, they most certainly will have a public paradigm on Tabroom, and you can read it. And the thing we've discovered is that there are a lot of judges who have very inappropriate things in their paradigms, right? And tons of things. Cursing, which I mean, okay, take or leave, but like cursing, offensive lyrics to songs. Oh golly, the biggest thing is judges trying to bribe students, right? Like saying, hey, if you bring me a Pepsi, I'll give you an extra speaker point, and like whatever, right? Just kind of gross things like that. Sometimes there's like sexual comments. Sometimes there's just all kinds of, so this best thing you can do, take 10 seconds, read their paradigm, make sure it's just about like, hello, I like to watch debate, and here's what I think a good debate looks like. It is not, hey child, please come bribe me so I will let you win. Or, you know, there'll be stuff that'll literally be like, spin around 3 times in your speech and I'll give you just ridiculous stuff that kids should not have to deal with. So that's really the number one way you can check that. And you would think if someone was asking you to hire them, they will have already cleaned that nonsense out of their paradigm. That is not the case. I can tell you, CHSAA doesn't even really hire judges for our state tournament, right? But I had someone reach out to me and they were like, hello, I know you're the state tournament director. I'm available for hire. Here's my paradigm. And I clicked on this dude's paradigm, and the literal beginning was just like, if you make a WWE reference, I will give you the win. Sir, did you think I was, anyway, that child got a telling off from me. It did not go well for that child. I don't think that went how that child thought it should. But I will tell you, in the research we've done, it's overwhelmingly particular demographics of judges that are most guilty of this. I mean, everybody kind of does it, right? But we see that kind of stuff, like the bribing and stuff on paradigms, most often in judges who are young male former competitors, right? So like 18 to 25 former competitors. And I think part of that is, it's a maturity and things like that, but it's also the difficult transition of like going from being a peer to being an educator, because that's, I think, an important thing we need to remind our judges is you are an educator when you're in the back of the room, right? You don't have to be a teacher. You're not a teacher, but you are an educator in the back of the room. You're the grown-up. It's your job to facilitate this debate in a safe way. So how do we hold our judges accountable? Well, as a tournament director, I can tell you the times we've had issues with these kind of judges, and there's people on this call who have witnessed this firsthand. We've had judges that have been, made inappropriate comments, whether intentionally or not, right? I always go to them first with the benefit of the doubt, right? Like I always try to give them an out, right? Like, hey, here's what I heard. Let's talk about it. And if they apologize and see what they did was wrong and they're willing to correct it, they can stay in my judge pool. But if they double down and, insist that it's okay to continue misgendering a student or something that makes our tournament space unsafe, I will then remove them. I know it's a struggle though, right? Because especially at local tournaments, it's so hard because we're so tight on judges, right? You don't want to spare somebody. But I'll tell you this, I'll put it this way. Debate tournaments get held up for a lot of stupid reasons all the time. Keeping our kids safe is not one of those stupid reasons, right? That's actually a really good reason. And so keeping the space safe is a really good reason to hold up the tournament. So if it takes a little longer, that's fine. But usually that's not even the case. Now, what can a tournament director do? Well, a tournament director, for example, at a local tournament, which might be your league president or something like that, could say, hey, we had to remove this judge, coach, please find a replacement or there's going to be a big fine, right? Or, hey, if your judges, I know one of the questions that got asked, and we'll get to in a second, was about what do you do when these kind of like bad judges, right, are holding up your tournament because they're not following the rules and stuff is taking longer? Well, they need to just be removed. I mean, is the honest answer. If they're not willing to listen, they've got to be removed. But the problem is if there's not a penalty for the school, that coach is going to continue to bring like lackluster judges, right? And so it's got to be a community of accountability. We have to all understand that like we're all in this together. We're all bringing diverse voices to the table. We're all trying to have the best kind of judges, right? But yeah, as a coach, I would talk to my judges before the tournament about, I would just say like morality, right? Like that's kind of like what we expect from you on a moral basis, not about your judging, but about, hey, remember you're the grown up in the room. And hey, remember, if you don't do this, I'm not going to pay you, right? Or we're not going to hire you again in the future or whatever, right? I think that's really important because ultimately like safety of everyone is our top priority and always, always should be. The final thing I would say is that empathy is key. In particular, over the last 2 years, we've all been through a whole lot, and everybody's going through a whole lot normally anyway. So for those of you that are in California, you know that at state this year, I was pretty loosey-goosey about judging. I was screaming and yelling a couple points, but for the most part, if people needed to swap out judges, I did it, right? If people needed accommodations, I did it. If people missed around, whatever, I did it, right? And I built in extra judging to give myself that leisure. Like I raised the judge requirement to build in a buffer that allowed me to do that, right? To fine, you need a round off, okay, go, bye. Whatever. It gave me a lot of luxury to do that. But it also allowed me, I can tell you, I got so many emails from folks this year that were so kind after that tournament, talking about just how nice it was to have a tournament that was telling them like, hey, it's okay, please, yeah, go take a round off, because that they're so not used to that, you know what I mean? And so having that kind of empathy, if you can muster it, if you have the ability, if you have the luxury, is great. I think also one of the great things, if we wanted to have a more empathetic tournament space for our judges, one of the cool things we could do is not mandate full day shifts, right? And I say this as someone who is just as guilty of this, right? Because the state tournament requires you to be there all day. So don't get me wrong. But one of the things you could do is work in shifts and say, hey, we'll let parents come or judges come, right, for half day or a quarter day or whatever that might be. Allow some flexibility, because especially for parents with young kids, right, it's a lot easier for them to get away for 2 hours than it is for them to get away for 14. Of course, that presupposes that your tournament is running on schedule, which is a big assumption, I will grant you. But that would be kind of my biggest thing I would emphasize, is just the importance of being as empathetic as you can swing given your circumstances, right? And so that's kind of my just general judging philosophy, is that we all need to be as kind as we possibly can be. But yeah, so to answer some of y'all's questions, one of the questions we got was what to do when you receive a tip about a judge in the tournament pool that you can't really investigate, i.e. Pre-tournament email saying the judge is creepy, which that is a valid thing. That happens a lot, right? Absolutely happens a lot. I will tell you, I take those emails very seriously and I investigate them, right? As somebody who does a lot of equity work in speech and debate, I'm doing it for a tournament in the East Coast this weekend. As somebody who does that a lot, I reach out to people. Now, I happen to be very connected, right? So I could ask a lot of people and say, hey, what do you know about X? Can you tell me whatever? And if it comes back that that tip is correct, I remove the person from my judge pool. It is a privilege and not a right to judge at a debate tournament, right? And so if somebody is pre-registered and I can tell you this, I have only once had one of them throw a fit about it. And Sarah knows this because it was at state. They started grumping about it. And my response was, let him come talk to me and I'll explain to him exactly why, right? Like I'm confrontational. I will happily explain to this person why they are not welcome in this space. This is not a court of law. You do not have a right to be here, right? My obligation is to keep my kids and my staff safe, right? And so you don't have a right to be here if we've got a bunch of people that can, validate that you've made this an unsafe space for them. And you might think that that gets abused, but it really does not. I can't say that. I can't think of any time I've actually had one of those where it's not 100% something that happened. is the nicest way to say it. So very rarely do we get those messages, but when we do, they're usually pretty serious. And I think the response is just remove it. And you can have a choice. Like I can tell you at state this year, we had a couple of those, and I don't think I even told the schools. I think I just didn't panel the person, right? Or I think there was one school where it was bad enough where I removed them, and I told the coach, and the coach was like, oh my God, do I need to find another judge? And it was so close to the tournament. I was just like, it's fine. You didn't know. It's okay, right? And I actually, again, I had the leisure, right? I had the luxury of letting that one slide. So it was a little bit easier in that situation. Somebody said, how can we support judges during tournaments? What do we do when judges have last minute changes to their commitments? That's a good question. Awesome. So I think the best way you can support judges, one, feed them really well when it's in person. That keeps a lot of people happy. Have warm coffee and good drinks, right? That a good food will quell a lot of uprisings during judge houses for sure. When you only have cold Little Caesars pizza and ice water, people are going to get a little testy with you, I think, regardless. So plan to have lots of good food. There's a tournament in California, the La Costa Canyon Winter Classic, where when they're in person, they are excellent about food. They have this team of parents that every hour brings out like new food. Like there's like pancakes 1 hour, and then the next hour there's like appetizers, and so like, and you just, everyone, when the tournament gets behind, which tournaments inevitably will get behind, right? No one cares because they're all just sitting there eating snacks in the judge house, and they're like eating pigs in a blanket and happy as a clam, right? So that's one nice thing you can do is by providing that. But I also think, just listening to folks. One thing I do as a tournament director is I have things like nursing rooms, right? For nursing mothers, right? So they have a place to go pump or nurse if they need to. We do things like have quiet rooms, right? Because sometimes in the hectic of it all, right, having some place to go sit and decompress is great. I also just listen, if somebody says they need like, hey, I'm really stressed, can I please have this round off? Of course, right? Like we'll make it work, we'll figure it out. Most people in my experience, I mean, there are some rare exceptions, unfortunately, of people who are more focused on winning, right? Rather than, they're gaining some competitive advantage rather than like doing what's right, unfortunately. But most people don't abuse the system. Most people are wonderful about this. And most people are so concerned about overstepping that they don't abuse it. And so for me, I think just making it very clear that like, this is where I stand on this. This is what I believe about this. Making my position on this, that I'm open and you can talk to me. It seems to have made things a little more open with folks, feeling comfortable. So I think just having a good dialogue and being transparent and empathetic is the best thing you can do to support your judges. One other question, and then we'll go to your live questions. Somebody said, we tend to have a problem with college age judges in that they think they know everything, so they ignore instructions, and that college rules are the norm and give oral feedback with nothing in writing to assist coaches. We're often desperate for judges, so any tips for dealing with this would be helpful. Yeah, I mean, I get it. It's hard. And here's the thing, whether you think like oral critiques are good or bad in debate, right, or speech, the problem is that like some of our tournaments, like the state tournament is on such a tight schedule. I do not have time for you to give verbal feedback, right? Like I do not, and like most verbal feedback is reasonable, right? But we all have been at many a tournament that has been held up because someone wants to prove to a group of teenagers how smart they are. And so they need to talk for an hour. And it is, bless them, that's fine, but like we just don't have time for it. And so I think that addressing that kind of problem actually has to come from the top, right? It has to come from the local leadership, whether it's the tournament director, the league president, whoever that might be. Got to take a hard stance on that. And I think, again, that's got to be communicated to the coaches, which is like, hey, talk to your judges, make sure that they understand we are not giving oral critiques here. And if your judges do, your team is going to get a fine, right? If that gets reported back, we're going to, listen, I want to be clear. I'm talking a lot about fines for somebody who abhors the idea of fining anyone. You can ask, again, McKendra, Sarah, they know this. Like I will do anything to not fine somebody, but sometimes, unfortunately, the only thing you can do is kind of have some sort of built-in, or maybe you say like, hey, maybe you do like a system where there's like demerits or something, right? Where like a team can't enter a tournament later or something. I don't know, you'd have to figure something out locally to deal with that. But I think once people know that there's some action that is taken off of that, right, that gets people to be more accountable. And that's really important. I think that's a really big thing. Oh, Adrian, they do that in college too. I guess the long verbal critiques. Yeah. Yes. And Matt's right too. The near peer judges are a blessing and a curse. That's 100% true, because it's great in that obviously the kids who are debating think they are so cool and want to hear what they have to say. But it comes with that difficulty of like, you need to know the line that you are no longer a peer, right? Like you are now an adult in the room and you've got to be safe, right? Oh yeah, set a word requirement for the ballot. So if you're using electronic ballots on Tabroom, it's super, super easy to set a minimum word requirement, right? So the judges have to write sentences. That's a really good thing. That avoids some of the, I'm just going to give verbal feedback and not give any comments to the judge. But also, here's another thing. Not to get on my soapbox, but I guess I'm on my soapbox already. One thing I struggle with is as we've moved to an electronic ballot world and an electronic tabbing world, we've moved to a world where we've reduced the number of grownups working in the tab room, right? which on its face, that's wonderful, right? We've kind of automated everything. And now one person can tab an entire division of an event, right? And do it quick and comfortable and amazing. The problem is we used to have a system where, I'll give you an example where locally we use, they still, I think in Bakersfield use paper ballots, but like you think of a traditional paper ballot tournament, what happens at that? Well, a judge comes into the judge house with their ballot. Somebody at a ballot intake table looks it over really quickly. They're not reading for content, but they're scanning it over. They can hand it back and say, please go fill this up. Or if there's something inappropriate on the ballot, they could see it right there in the moment and flag it, right? Then when you take that paper ballot back into tab, you've got multiple people reading it and entering it and checking it, meaning they're checking for content, right? That does not exist in an electronic ballot world, right? Because in most tournaments, what happens is you have one person tabbing an entire division of 700 entries of public forum by themselves. They haven't left their desk all day. They're not reading a single ballot because they're exhausted and overwrought, right? And the ballot comes in, all we see is that it's in, we call it a day, and then we push it out to the kids, right? And so there's no accountability in the meantime to check to make sure there are not inappropriate comments. And the sad reality is, as a coach, I guarantee you, every single person here has had to lose a ballot that had inappropriate comments on it over the years. Every single one of us has had to do that. And so what I would encourage you to do is if you are at a tournament, or especially if your local tournaments are using electronic ballots, and there are a lot of coaches now who maybe don't have jobs at the tournament anymore, have a couple folks set up a committee to just check the ballots between each round, right? We did it at state. I had every tab room checking it. I also had extra backup checks on things too. But it really doesn't take that long. Especially for teachers, God bless you all, but like the English teachers who are used to having to read a million essays, you can read fast, you can scan, and you can just check and see if it, says the B word or something inappropriate. So that's another kind of great thing that you can do. So what are y'all thoughts? Do y'all have any specific questions after hearing all that? Yeah, Kimberly.
I want to address the ballot checking. Yeah. And I don't know if this is something that in terms of tab room could be made a little friendlier for ballot checking. Because the way that it stands right now, the person that's going to check a ballot needs to be able to go in to edit ballot and review the comments. And that's kind of scary sometimes. And then, yeah. Is there where's the other place then, Sarah?
Yeah, Sarah, how do you explain?
Yeah, so it's actually on the schematic. If you pull up any tournament, like, let me just pull up something real quick. Sorry.
Because I go in schematic edit. So where's the feedback?
So like if you go to schematic and then you go to reports, is it reports? Or is it? Let me find it. Oh yeah. So if you go to results, there's a view RFDs button and they're all right there.
Mm-hmm. And that's the reports in.
So like schematics, pick your event, pick your round.
Right.
Click on results. There's a green view RFDs button.
Okay. And does that give, for speech events, does that break down individual and Congress individual or just RFDs?
Let me look and let me see. Few comments. It gives individual comments for the kids as well as the general RFD. So it gives everything.
Okay. Because the other thing that we wanted to do is to open it up to do coach review, but there's too many coaches that give students extra, like too many people have access on tab room. So it would be, or if there was a way that you could designate in a tournament who had maybe another level that could be limited even down to coach.
You can. So that's an option too. You can set it so just the coaches can see it, but like it's not.
But the coaches viewed as people on the tab room account?
So my recommendation for you is to pick one person whose job it is to, after every round, go in, get to that page, go to print it, but instead of printing it, save it as a PDF and then email it out to your committee.
Yeah, okay.
And that's a smart idea. Yeah, to have it checked, which is what part of what we did a little bit at state to get around that.
Yeah.
Easier.
Yeah. And the challenging part, because we were trying to do that and we had an extra couple volunteers. But they're trickling through, right? So we always tell them, get the ranks in, and like trying to, it's a lot harder than it used to be. But we're trying to get to that point. But thank you, Sarah, for telling me about that window.
I think what makes it harder too is a lot of tournaments are doing to keep the tournament moving. We're telling the judges, just enter your ranks and then you can edit your comments later, because we're trying to keep it. So maybe we need to think about when we're building our schedules, like I hate to say it, right? Like maybe just because we can punish ourselves by having these absurd back to back to back to back to back, maybe we shouldn't. I don't know. That's a whole other philosophical discussion, that maybe we need to have more humane schedules in speech and debate. And, I think definitely when your tournaments are virtual, you have a lot more luxury with that, right? Like as far as like your timing, and you can let them have more time to fill it out between a round. But it definitely is difficult when you say like, hey, you've got until Thursday to fill out your your comments, and then someone from tab has to go back and check. So I think definitely having like reasonable limitations on that before you release the comments to kids is super important, like for sure. Yeah. Other comments, questions? Oh yeah. Yes, Carol.
I've been judging for 23 years. And I would say in all that time, the judging pool has never reflected the diversity of the student population. And for, there's numerous reasons.
Yeah.
How do we address that? How do we get the underrepresented represented?
Absolutely. That's such a great question. And that is something that I'm very, very passionate about and feel very strongly about, because it's definitely important, right? We all know representation matters. We know that like you could be entering the kindest, most wonderful room in, on the floor, right? It doesn't matter. But if there's nobody that looks like you, it can still be a very stressful and intimidating situation, regardless of how kind and lovely and great those folks are, right? So we definitely want to have more diverse judge pools. I can tell you a couple things I've done. I don't think there's like a perfect solution by any stretch, right? But one of the things I've done is, first, when I first got elected to my position in CHSAA, and some of y'all might remember this, I made a conscious effort to drive around the state and visit debate tournaments. And part of that was quite literally, I kept a notebook in my purse and I wrote down anybody I thought would be a good judge, or a good person to work in tab. And that was temperament, right? That was me meeting people who I just thought were really nice and, smart and amazing. But also, the problem is if I were to email league presidents and say like, hey, I need more diverse judges, can you please give me a list of people who qualify? I'm going to mostly get radio silence back, right? And that's just because like most people are really busy, or it's hard, right? So I consciously like met people, and that's one thing I could do from my position. The other thing I did is I made it very clear that this is something that is super important to me. And by doing that, people then were more trusting of my motivation, and not that I was trying to like take advantage of people or anything. And suddenly we get more volunteers and people kind of doing that. Now, as far as like practical things you can do as a coach, there are tons of great organizations. I mean, for example, listen, if you were to reach out to, for example, if you're up in Sacramento, reach out to the Black Youth Leadership Project and say, hi, we need more Black judges. We do. We need our students to be in front of more diverse people. Here's why we need it. Can you help me? Right? Or reaching out to, some different, Latinx organizations, things like that, right? Queer organizations, people like that. It's a great way, and just be earnest about it, right? Just say like, that's the thing I've learned. And it's a difficult thing to navigate, by the way, as a white lady. Like I fully recognize that, right? As a white lady, navigating this can be difficult. But me just being straight up and saying like, I want these kids to actually have to, be in front of diverse voices, be in front of diverse minds, and have diverse people filling out ballots. Can you help? Let me tell you, most people are down to help, right? And so reaching out and just being honest about it, saying like, listen, our judge pool skews pretty white and male, right? Like in kind of two different ways. And it varies across the state, by the way. Certain leagues are not like that and stuff. But, when you just are very upfront about that, people usually are willing to help. And like the thing I have at state is there are certain coaches who will literally just send me a list and be like, hello, I know you need people, Angel, because now they know that this is something I feel very strongly about. And so then I'll just get a long list, right? The other thing you can do, and I do encourage, is if you're using Tabroom for your league tournaments, to have diversity enhanced judging turned on, right? Which is where the judge can voluntarily check a little box that says that they're a diversity enhanced judge. Now, it doesn't have them disclose what makes them diverse, right? Because that could be a problematic thing. I want to be very clear that, like, asking a judge to disclose how they're diverse is a problem for example, if somebody is a trans person that is not out, or a queer person that is not, somebody with a non-visible form of marginalization, having them out themselves is not a good thing, right? We don't want that to happen. So I do it on a trust system. The hardest part is just getting people to fill it out. Like, there will be people who I know, gosh darn well, are diverse who don't check the box, right? And so one thing you can do is, leading up to the tournament, really kind of, you're doing a PR campaign, right? You're going out and you're telling people, this is something that matters. I'm going to send you follow-up emails to our league and remind you to remind your judges to check that box if they qualify, right? And that helps you. But there's no quick, easy answer, unfortunately, but the best thing you can do is partner with, diverse organizations in your community, and every single community has one. And you would be surprised how happy they are to help, because most are very understanding that this is something that's needed desperately, right? And so that's an awesome thing. Yeah. Other questions? Oh, Matt, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say, obviously, race, gender, ethnic diversity, sexual orientation diversity is obviously very important. The one kind of diversity, sorry about that, the one kind of diversity I've been actually really concerned about, particularly with the online debates, is socioeconomic diversity. Are there any best practices that are kind of fomenting up right now? Because we had a tournament this spring. It's one of those things I'll never forget. We had 2 kids who were on a yacht in the Caribbean, and we had 2 kids who were homeless on the streets of LA. I mean, so yeah, but that's just, I mean, it's a whole other, and with the way the state's going now. So I'm just curious, both you and to everyone on the Zoom, if they have any suggestions.
Yeah, I think definitely that's a great question, Matt. That's awesome. Yeah, I think that definitely, as far as judging, how can we have economic, diversity in our judges? Pay them, right? Like, that's the reality. And this is the same too when we're talking about diverse folks, right? Like, we're talking about, racial or things like that. We need to pay people, right? And that's the honest truth. We've got to pay people their worth to come and for their labor, right? Like, that's a very important thing. And that matters even more, right? For somebody who is potentially, economically struggling, right? The things you could do, having great food, right? Make sure they can eat, make sure that you're paying them for their time. Those are small things. And especially if you're at a school that maybe has a little more privilege and you've got a little more wiggle room in your budget, or if you don't even have it in your budget, but you know that if you charge the parents $50 more, they're really not going to, like, you've got a demographic that they're not going to care. You can compensate. One of the things I've really appreciated with CHSAA is the number of coaches who are at hyper privileged schools, which is how I will delicately say that, who have reached out to me and been like, charge us more. and they're saying, like, charge us more so you don't have to charge the others more. Like, they are openly saying that, right? So that is something that does happen. I mean, as far as the students, it definitely gets more complicated, right? That's one of the best things you can do, I think, when you're in person in particular, but even when you're online, I'm going to be honest. CHSAA has a food insecurity program that we've had at state for the last couple of years that we built out. And it's fantastic. We're at the state tournament. Any kid, no questions asked, either the kid, their coach, or their parent can sign them up, and they will, on the first day of the tournament, get money so they can eat the entire weekend. No questions asked, right? And it's not like it's either cash or like a Visa debit card, right? So they are good to go for the entire weekend. We know that in California, 1 in 5 students, and this is actually pre-pandemic, so it might be worse now, 1 in 5 kids goes to bed hungry every night, right? And so that is like a real serious problem. And so for the kids, one of the most wonderful things I think a lot of folks are moving toward, I only know of a couple tournaments that do this so far, but and it's definitely our goal with state, is they're moving toward a system where food is just free. Like, you don't sell food at the tournament, right? It's just like it would be for judges. Every kid gets a ticket and they get to go have lunch, right? And that makes it something, when you make it something that applies to everyone, there's no shame, which is a beautiful thing that you can do, especially for people suffering from like economic marginalization and stuff. So having like a food program, and I can tell you, of all the things I ask for money for CHSA, which is a lot, the food insecurity program is the number one thing that is so easy to get funded, because I can call a law firm and they'll be like, yeah, we'll give you $1,000, right? We'll give you it. When you talk about hungry kids, and also we have a flyer, Mackinder can send over that flyer too. We have our food insecurity flyer, but it's got some data about this. And you're welcome, by the way, if any of you want any of these flyers, I can send you the version that you can edit so you can put your own information on it. But if you wanted to create like a league food insecurity program, that's awesome. You should. That is a really cool thing you could do. And I think that's a great way to help the kids with like that kind of marginalization. Another thing you can do, and we've gotten a little better about this in the world of online, weirdly enough, because NSDA also put on their ballots at the first online nationals, put up that kind of little warning about like, hey, please don't judge the kids by their backgrounds or their camera quality or whatever. I think that's really important. That goes back to that discussion about implicit bias, right? When we talk about implicit bias with the judges, it can't just be about gender and race, right? It also has to be about things like accents, right? It has to be about things like non-neurotypical kids who might have tics or things like that, right? Like, and not holding that against them. It's also got to be about, things like, hey, please recognize this. This is a speech I would always give at our local tournaments, which is, please recognize that you might see kids in really sharp suits, and you might see kids who aren't as sharply dressed. And you've got to recognize that all of those kids are wearing their absolute best clothes that they can today. And so please don't hold it against them, right? They are trying their best, and please don't take that into an account of their judging, and please don't comment on it unless it's just very positive, right? Like I as a judge try very hard, obviously never to comment, but occasionally I'll be like, hey, this didn't factor into your score, but you have the coolest glasses I've ever seen, right? that kind of thing is okay. But I think reminding them that, how kids are dressed and things like that don't impact also is super important for economic stuff. Yeah. But the food program, that would be, if there's one thing you all take away from this, please go back to your leagues and start food insecurity programs. And you can even do it if you're having virtual tournaments, right? Because you could Venmo the kids money. You could send them a Visa gift card. You could do whatever. In the state of California, this has gotten a lot better, obviously, in the last year, right? Because a lot of teams, because the state mandate, right, where like pretty much everybody gets free lunch now, right? That helps. That's one other thing real quick. In California, because if you're at a school with free and reduced lunch, right, which I think is everybody now, if you are off campus for a tournament on a school day, so let's say you leave Friday morning to drive up to a tournament, right, to an invitational, the school has to give you lunch for your entire team. I don't know if you guys know that, but that is a thing in California. If you're at a public school, right, it is either packed breakfast and lunch for every kid on your team, or it is $5 per meal per kid given to you cash. So you either can give that money to the kids, or you could, probably more smartly buy like a family style thing to feed everybody. But I think when we can kind of just treat everybody exactly the same, right? And just recognize like, hey, everybody's getting food. We as a team are all pooling our resources together, and we're going to get pizza and salad as a team. That takes away a lot of the stigma and shame for a lot of the kids. And that's super, super important. Yeah, McKendra.
So if I can just pop in here, I think one of the things that I love doing is finding ways to feed kids, because at my core, I really like food and I really like kids. But one of the things I did learn was that every grocery store that is a Safeway based, like Vons, Raley's, Safeway, Smart and Final, they all have to give so much money away monthly. So what I did is I actually created on my team a position where the student is responsible for contacting stores. They give a $25 gift card to every team. Then what I do is I just make everybody like chooses what they want, if they want meat sandwiches or if they want peanut butter and jelly or whatever. And we go buy groceries, and then we just have a team table set up with lunch fixins, and then everybody can make what they need during the tournament day. But then nobody feels the responsibility to bring to that. Now, I come from a big family as far as adopted kiddos, so I love the idea of having like 1 foot on the floor rule. You can grab what you can grab, but keep 1 foot on the floor. And so we operate that way, but we also encourage kids to bring what they can. And the beauty of that is if there is something there, then everybody has something. And so utilizing those gift cards at the grocery stores, awesome possum. Grocery Outlet does it too. And if you check monthly, and this gets a little sketchy, so you have to watch dates as far as expiration, but if they are not expired foods at the end of the month and they haven't gone past the post date, they have to get rid of those supposedly a week to 2 weeks before they expire. And technically they're still okay after that based off of off of the FDF. I can't remember the stupid acronym. The point is, monthly, I go to Grocery Outlet and pick up a box of food for stuff for my kids. And I can bring that to a tournament and set it on a table too. And it's usually the things that are like Pop-Tarts or granola bars, things that are technically considered non-perishable, but nobody is picking those up. Places like Panera and Starbucks and stuff are utilizing their extras for shelters in towns, but the stores are not. So if you need that for your team, it's a great way to use it. Sorry, not so said as eloquently, but there's a purpose there.
No, it's so important. That's awesome. Yeah, that's really, really helpful because that's a really big thing, I think, to make sure that everybody can eat. Like I'm a big proponent of anytime I've hosted a tournament, we have way too much food. And usually the end of it is me and McKendra driving around and giving it to nice people that we find who need food, right? Like we'll leave, McKendra and I constantly leave tournaments with piles of food and just drive around and find, unhoused people who maybe could benefit from it, right? So that's the other beauty of it is you can take those extras and give them out. And so feed your judges well and what they don't eat. I will often, we've done this at state, I will let kids come in and grab the food out of the staff lounge and stuff like that, right? If they need it, we have a lot of options, I think, and it benefits everybody when we do it. Yeah. We are 7:05 and I promise to be respectful of your time. So any other questions? Happy to take them. I have nowhere to go, so it's fine.
Add one more thing onto that too,
Yep.
Angela. I have taught at both schools of privilege and schools without. In my school of privilege, one of the things that we would do after our dinners that we would have, a lot of kids would have excess, but we weren't going back to hotels that would have refrigerators or ways to keep that food. So we as a team, we would do the same thing Angel and I have done. We would drive around until we found people who needed it. So it's a good practice in kindness.
Mm-hmm. Again, all goes back to empathy, right? Like whether we're being, and I want to be very clear, I'm not always perfect about being the most empathetic little Zen person in the world. I will grant you that. But when we prioritize empathy, whether it's in the tournament space, with our teams, with our students, with our judges, it's beneficial to everybody, right? It just puts us all in a better place and makes us a stronger community. And so it's a really important thing we can do for our judges as well, is to share that empathy. Yeah, Chris. Christopher Harris. Oh, hello.
Hey, thanks for all this. This was really good. I enjoyed it. It was great to have so much of this reinforced. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us know a lot of this already, and we often don't think about it. There were a lot of new points as well, but I just really enjoyed the reinforcement of good practices when it comes to judging.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, and I was going to add, I once had a judge, and I'm just going to add this story because I kept thinking about it. I once had a parent tell me that they would not pass a background check. And I was so nervous, like anxiety all over me that entire night at practice. I got home, I still was just filled with anxiety. I felt like so bad. This parent was picking up their student, and the next day I called the administrator, my principal, and we were on great terms the entire time. And I just said, "Hey, Paul, I've got to tell you this." And sure, and because I felt like I'm a mandatory reporter. I didn't get into it with this parent. I just, listened to him tell me that he can't pass a background check. So I told the principal, they performed the background check on him because they felt like it was a smart thing to do, which I kind of agreed with, even though it wasn't my call, but smart move. This guy came up squeaky clean, like nothing.
That's the problem. And I can tell
Turns
you.
out,
Mhm.
it turns out this parent just wanted to get out of judging.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
'Cause of course I confronted him. I couldn't let that go.
Imagine how badly you don't want to judge that you'd be willing to have everyone think you're a
Right?
child molester.
Just to let you know the lengths that people will go.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Chris. I will give you a counter example to that I know that there are people who, in just this last summer, who got hired by camps, who once they got hired, other people were like, this person like has a conviction for buying alcohol for minors, right? And they were like, what are you talking about? I ran a background check and it didn't come up, right? So even things like legal convictions don't
Wow.
always show up in background checks, right? And that's the problem. Yeah, Sarah.
So I have another story in that same vein. I once was at a tournament watching some kids, and when they Googled their judge to try to find their judge's paradigm, they didn't find his paradigm. They found his profile on the Megan's Law website.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and I had to tell the tournament and the college that recommended that judge to this high school tournament. And the worst part is the college, he was supposed to report that to them. He had never done it because he had come from another state where he had technically ran out his term. In California, you don't get away from it, but in like states like Tennessee, you can.
Oh, so he thought he was clear and then wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, these
Well,
kids.
one other thing I was going to add is that I learned this from working with Bellarmine for years in CFL. They host our NAT quals every year, at least Kim Jones used to.
Mhm.
And they do their own background check for the Catholic diocese.
Right.
And it's based on zip code. My understanding is that that's not like a complete check, but at least it's a really good start.
Mhm.
And I forget, if anyone's interested, like email me because I'm going to find out myself. It's a really easy system, and it's, from what I understand, it was free. Like Kim told me it was free. So I don't know if that was because they were part of the diocese or whatever, but something to look into. Free
That's awesome.
background checks, right?
And also just like ask, right? Like here's the thing. I not to speak for her, I'm sure she'll agree. Feel free, ask Sarah and I, hey, do you know this person? Are they okay? Like, and if we don't, we probably know someone who does and can tell you, like, oh yeah, they're fine. That happens to me weekly. I get emails or texts from people like, hey, do you know, especially now that we're in a virtual world, I'm having, tournament directors from the East Coast be like, who's this California person? Can you tell me, are they cool? Like, should I hire them? Right. And most of the time it's fine, but sometimes it's not fine.
Well, you're also a well-respected person in the community.
Sort of.
I don't know how I feel about that with someone that's not, right? Like maybe
I think
some new college kid that's like, maybe there's a better way for the least experience.
Well, with the least experienced people, though, is if they're young former students, I can just message their coach, right? And say, hey, I looked you up on the NSDA. This kid debated for you. Are they cool? Like, are they fine? Are they the kind of kid yes, is that extra legwork? Is that extra work for y'all? Yeah, and you're already stressed and doing a million things. So I'm not trying to add to your plate, but maybe that's 5 minutes that's well spent, because it's gonna, if we all do it, it's gonna make us all a little safer, right?
I was just gonna say, talking to the coaches is really good.
Yeah,
I think it's a really good idea to do that. I had some students who were some of the best on my team, and then they made some really poor choices publicly. And I had coaches contact me and say, these are your kids. To which I was like, do I have to claim them? Because afterwards I didn't realize what foolish choices they were making. And in truth, they were just trying to financially scam everybody. Not just, they were jerks, but they were trying to get more money out of a tournament by signing up for multiple schools for that tournament to be on their hiring. And I was mortified that they would make a unethical decision like that. So of course, then my response was to blast to everybody I knew at that tournament, do not hire these names, because it is important that we obviously maintain integrity, both as the coach they came from and the behavior that they're exhibiting wasn't something that I would have endorsed. And I don't want either one of those names affiliated with each other. So those became a blacklisted name that became very public, and that's fine. They made poor choices, and we need to then respond appropriately to that. But by all means, contacting the coach was awesome, because the coaches who did contact were like, I can't imagine that this would be something you would want. And I was like, correct. In terms of Mortal Kombat, finish them. But
That is a very good point, McKendra, I gotta
Can I-
say. And
can I-
absolutely true. And one thing, if I could add to that, is that I've been someone that other coaches have contacted when students have graduated and asking for jobs and whatnot. And initially I was like just big pubbing all my students, right? And sure enough, like McKendra says, those students, they grow up and they learn some bad habits. And I've had to reel in, and been a lot more careful and preface a lot of what I say with, hey, while they were with me, they did this and they didn't show signs of whatever, but
I've heard this since, right? Yeah.
Right.
Hey, can I say though, just real quick, because I've seen both sides of that. We have one kid who, very, very much developed an ego. She was a big fish in a small pond. And, even if we wanted to hire her for anything, our school president would not allow it, period. We've had those conversations. On the other hand, we do have another one of our alums. She was pretty immature when she graduated, and so she went to a decent school, but she's pulling straight A's. And she's applying to some good grad schools. And so she's really turned a corner and grown up a lot. And so, that's just, we're all on different paths, I think. And so that's,
Well, you can totally, I think that's a good point too, because people change, right? Like obviously like McKendra and Matt and Chris are saying, like sometimes kids are great students and then maybe not so great adults. And sometimes they are, just coasting by as students and become exceptional adults, right? Some of the students who I wasn't super close with when they were competitors, right? Like are friends now, like actual friends, right? And I would happily recommend them for jobs and do. So I think it's just us talking with each other. And you've got to remember in your head, judging is a privilege, not a right, right? Like this is not, you will hear from people, well, speech and debate events are public events and everyone is, no, stop that. Like this is a school event. They don't just let anyone walk onto a school campus and start yelling at children, right? Even the protesters about vaccines and stuff now have to stay across the street. They're not allowed to like sit in a room and yell at a child, right? Like that does not happen. Our first goal is keeping those kids safe. Our second goal is running an efficient, educational, empowering tournament. But safety is the first priority always above everything else, right? And like if you didn't see in the chats, like Sarah said, there's now a report on Tab Room that you can click that'll tell you if judges are judging at multiple tournaments, right? So that's good too. So awesome. All right. Oh yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'll put my hand down. Just the other thing was, I just want to ask if Angelique or any of you have any other suggestions in terms of best practices for handling near peer judges, because it's where it was said before, it's the same thing with college tournaments with grad students or recently graduated students. It's just, they haven't, as you've said before, they haven't grown up, they haven't kind of turned the corner necessarily in terms of that. So I'm just curious to hear what other people have to say on that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to hear what other folks say. I know for me, it's just, I have eminent patience when I'm dealing with students at a tournament. Like when we have an equity problem that's based, that comes from students, right? It's a student said something. I will sit there and talk to that kid till I'm blue in the face to help them understand and be patient. I have increasingly less patience the older the person gets that I'm having to deal with an equity issue with, right? Like I have, if I've got an adult who's making a very inappropriate comment, that changes it, right? So I think having patience for those people is really important, but I think also because they're newer or younger or less experienced, having really clear expectations and boundaries is really important, right? Like I will not hire you if you put this in your paradigm. And it's not just take it out of your paradigm. I need to hear from you that you understand why that was inappropriate to have in your paradigm, right? And if you're not at that place yet, call me in a year, right? And if you're not that place, maybe call me in another year, right? Sarah?
So I did a lot of young first year out judge training as the equity officer for Ascend this year. And I was really, really blunt that this meant that you can't go play Among Us with the kids. You have to build boundaries between them and you. You are now an adult in a place of power. And I spent like at least an hour and a half laying out to them, where they are now versus where they were. And so even though they went to camp with a lot of these people they're now coaching and they were friends and friendly, that meant they had to start putting in place a wall. Because they are an adult and those people are still children. And they all really got it. And in fact, many of them reached out to me multiple times to be like, hey, this kid keeps messaging me on Instagram about camp, and I know we're not supposed to do that. And it made it very like easy for them to be like, Sarah, is this okay? Is this not okay? How do I deal with this? How do I address it? If you, like Angel said, place expectations on these young people, these young judges, these first year outs, and you also say like, but hey, things happen, right? Come to me, we can address it. They're more likely to, be a safe person for these young judges you're working with to come to. I think a lot of the things Angel said today about like how to interact with judges is to have empathy for judges. And especially with these young judges, if we want them to keep coming back, we need to make sure that they feel safe, as well as, we want to keep the kids safe. We want to make sure that they're comfortable in their spaces, and they're trying to figure out this new place they are too, just like the kids are still figuring themselves out. Just because they graduate and turn 18 doesn't make them like a full-blown grown adult, but they need to understand that they've transitioned, and explaining that transition to them, I found really helped them.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point too that we didn't really talk about, which is judges reaching out to kids on social media, which seems to be happening at an increasing and alarming rate. Either finding kids on Facebook or Instagram, or adding them on Snapchat, which is terrifying because that deletes, right? That's like a very bad thing to have. Or even, I will tell you, I bulk and I will reach out to people if their judging paradigm has their email address and they say, email me if you want some tips after, which that on its face seems harmless, right? But if you are a 19-year-old saying, hey, email me after the round to a 16-year-old, like, I don't know, or if you're a 40-year-old saying that to us, like it is, even if it is meant well, right? Like even if it's meant with the best of intentions, anyone here who's been in education, it's like, hey, I wouldn't sit in my classroom with the door closed with a kid, right? Like I know I don't do that, even though I've got the best of intentions, the door is open or someone else is there. And it's the same idea, like, no, you should not be having private communication. And usually when I have to talk to judges about that, the way I explain it that seems to get through to them is, this is for your protection. Like, this isn't just like, I don't think you're gonna like go be inappropriate with this kid, but if you are privately talking to this kid on Snapchat, what if the kid says you did something, right? Like, and I've never seen that happen where like a kid's like falsified that sort of thing. Like, don't get me wrong, I've never seen that, but framing it in that context tends to help the judges understand that that's maybe not appropriate. But I mean, I've had to remove someone from the state championship of California for messaging kids during the tournament that they were judging in the Congress round and saying things like, why the F would you make that argument? That was a bad argument, right? Like cursing at kids, giving them critiques in the middle of the round. I mean, just absurd things, right? And that this person was a coach. This person, like, there's just so much to this, right? And so I just say, like, also having like a social media discussion with them, right? Because especially for someone younger, that boundary doesn't exist, right? And some of these competitors might be their Instagram, friends or whatever, they might follow them on Instagram. And so that makes it even harder. For sure.
And I just add the one thing and all that too is just a real kind of wake up call for some of our judges and assistant coaches has been just Catholic schools, obviously with the wonderful scandals that they've had over the last, since I was little. It's a wake up call when they have to go through the screening, the background check, the child abuse training and whatnot. And that's where, at least in terms of the coaching side of things, obviously it's not the same thing with judges, but yeah, it's a wake up call that you're being responsible for someone else's children.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, you're the grown up in the room, right? And whether you realize it or not, and that can be the hard thing. That is a hard lesson. So I like Sarah also saying like to be empathetic about that. And you're right, Matt, like having any kind of training with that is so helpful, and it's eye-opening. And that's the exact thing you and Sarah are both talking about with having kind of dedicated safe space training. is usually more illuminating than we think, right?
Well, it's just, it's too with, because, you know, I've spent a ton of time in college tutoring kids in the inner city, and it's just, not every kid comes from a safe, stable home
Mhm.
and has that, you know, there are a lot of kids, as you said, in different ways, are hurting on the inside in different ways that you might not immediately be aware of. So,
That's true. That's true. All right, so well, we are 7:23. I've abused all of your time. Or if you're Dawn, 9:23, and Adrian, I think you're in the back there too. So we are all done for today. Like I said, please, I really recommend Kendra will send out the sign up for next month's, which is awesome, awesome, awesome. All about you know, trauma-informed education for our students. And that includes, I'm going to tell you what started this was I literally asked her what I could do with us having state in person again, right? That's going to be like a very anxious, overwhelming thing for a lot of people, not just kids. I know for me too, for all of us, right? Like being in a big group of people. So how do we mitigate some of those harms for folks? How do we reduce the stress? And she had some brilliant ideas. And so she's going to have some brilliant ideas next month. And you've got to come listen to Miss Shantae McCrae. She's amazing. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate you all. Thank you, friends.
Thank you so much.
this was great.